Good afternoon. Welcome to the Weekly Livestock Market Update. I'm Brownfield anchor reporter Megan Grebner. With us to talk all things livestock markets is University of Missouri, Scott Brown. Good afternoon, Scott.
Good afternoon, Megan.
Really not a ton for us to get into this week, but to kick things off, let's recap what happened this week in the markets.
Certainly had a roller coaster ride when you look at markets generally this week. But if we start on the cattle side of the equation, we saw cash-fed cattle down about $1.60 this week, while many of those feeder cattle sales this week were steady to $5 lower. The future side for cattle was a very tough week, with the June live cattle futures contract closing down $7.85, while the May feeder cattle contract closed down $7.50 this week. The choice box beef value was up nearly $1 this week, as we saw some strength in loins helping drive that choice box beef price higher. On the hog side, we actually saw barrow and gilt cash prices that were nearly $2 higher this week. Yet that May lean hog futures contract closed down $2.87 this week. The pork cutout value was also down roughly 60 cents this week, and we had bellies prices all over the board this week, but that down relative to a week ago, that I think led to the weakness in that pork cutout value. So it was quite a roller coaster ride for that belly market this week.
Volatility really seems to be the key in what's going on as we watch the pork and the hog markets. Specifically, is China still in the news about China and African swine fever? Is it still kind of keeping its thumb on what's going on and driving markets one way or the other?
It sure seems to be adding to all the volatility. As much as we'd like to have perfect information, we continue to just get bits and pieces of information that's very hard to confirm. So markets are going to continue to be, I think, pretty volatile as more of that news unfolds.
Let's talk a little livestock slaughter, one of the reports that came out this week. And I think the thing that jumps out to me the most, Scott, is the fact that there's really a lot of pork production going on here in the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at overall pork production for the first quarter of this year, out of that report, we were up 2.9%. And so I think, again, as we talk about that volatility, domestic supplies continue to grow. And I think that's the drag on these markets. And you got African swine fever trying to be the pusher of these markets. And, they both win at different points in time. But it does confirm that we're continuing to see growth in pork production in this first quarter. On the cattle side, actually different news. Beef production actually down 0.8% for the first quarter of 2019. And a few things stick out to me when you start to look at slaughter numbers. So steer slaughter down 4% that first quarter, while heifer slaughter up nearly 8%, 7.9%. Tells me that, again, we're probably finding some stability in terms of that beef cow herd. Although beef cow slaughter was basically unchanged for the first quarter of 19, it seems to me that the additional heifers that we've been slaughtering suggest we're not going to see a lot of growth. But maybe equally impressive is just the drop in weights we've seen on the cattle side. We were 16 pounds below year ago level for March. I think that's the fourth consecutive month in a row where we've had double-digit declines in terms of pounds. So we certainly started the year differently. I remind us that, if we were to start to talk about weights returning to year ago levels, we'll talk about probably beef production that grows as we go through the remainder of this year.
Is that a lot of some of the struggle that we've had with weather this winter coming into play in some of that, and even into last fall as well?
Yes, I think, weather is the large driver in where we've been. And so I guess, part of the story is we probably anticipate we're going to find weights returning to more, quote, normal or previous year levels, if you will. And I think that probably spells that we'll continue to see beef production catch up to year ago levels as we go through the remainder of this year.
I think the other story we got to talk about this week is those cold storage numbers and the amount of beef, pork, and chicken and turkey that we're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you can get a little bit of bullishness out of that report. So the end of March, those inventories were 1.5% lower than a year ago. If you look individually for a minute, boneless beef was down 1.3%. We talk about pork products that were even pork products. All right. So we talked about the increase in production, yet ending stocks as of the end of March were 0.1% lower. And we talked a lot about chicken stocks that were burdensome in many months of 2018 that for the end of March were 3% lower than a year ago as well. Now, so lower than a year ago, if we started looking at the 5-year average, we still talk about ending stocks that are above those 5-year averages, but probably some good news out of that cold storage report today.
Is the chicken number specifically probably the one that jumps out at you the most? I mean, that's the one that we've been talking about, the glut and not knowing, being able to move that product.
Certainly looks like the chicken industry's found its supply point better than they had for much of 2018, and more carefully supplying product that matches the consumption side of the equation. So absolutely, I think that's a better move. Now, just to keep this in perspective, relative to their 5-year average, they're still up 13%. But I always expect stocks to grow when you have growing production.
All right, not a lot really reports for us to dig into this week. I want to talk, though, a little bit before we wrap up about China's pork production. There's been some reports that the African swine fever outbreak has probably reshaped what their herd looks like. How does a disease outbreak like this, and the fact that it's still active and there's no vaccination, impact an industry and country like this?
Yeah, so I think when you look at the China hog inventory, we always talk about it in a couple of different ways. So one's a lot of backyard production, and then more commercial or confinement kind of operations that are in China. It seems to me that one doesn't have to go very far to say, we probably are going to see the end of a lot of that backyard production. I think the Chinese government was trying to figure out ways to make that part of pork production decline regardless of the disease outbreak. But an African swine fever outbreak just reminds them of how tough it is to contain when you've got a few hogs scattered in a number of operations. So I think we'll see a potentially a big structural change when we come out the other side, where the pork production that is left in China, which we can question where that is, but what's left will be more of a confinement type, and we'll see a lot less of the backyard production going forward.
I think the other thing I want to talk about real quick is the lack of information that we have, and solid information that we have. How does that continue to impact the volatility in our market, and why is that such a big part of this story?
Yes, I always say, as a market analyst, I hate this speculation that's going on right now in the marketplace. We all may be getting bits and pieces of information from different sources, but it's just impossible to know with certainty what's really happening there. And so that forces us to some of the speculation that you see out there about how big the cuts are going to be. Some of that speculation maybe is more grounded than others, but it just means that sometimes we're going to move markets with that speculative discussion when in fact the reality might look different. And so I really hesitate, and I think you and I have had this conversation so many times about African swine fever, and I wish we could tell viewers the exact impacts at this point, but we just lack that good information, and so that just entices a lot of volatility. We run prices too high, chasing some speculative information that would suggest a big cut in production, to then come back and say, oh, well, maybe it's not going to be as grand as we think because the Europeans are going to get a bunch of that pork imports, and so we next week move lower. I just encourage producers in this country to think really hard about risk management in what's going to continue to be a volatile market.
All right, Scott, that'll do it for us this week. As we look ahead to next week, what reports are we watching for there?
We'll get some demand side information next week with restaurant performance, as well as a jobs report to round out the week.
All right, we will talk to you next Friday. Have a great weekend.
You do the same, Megan.
To have our weekly livestock market update delivered to your email box every Saturday, visit our website, brownfieldagnews.com. You can submit questions or comments there as well. And for market updates twice daily, make sure to check out John Perkins' Market Minute. Have a great weekend. I'm Megan Grebner for Brownfield.